Hey there, Kipsters. We are looking at objectives 1B.7 through 8. That is the associative, the commutative, the identity, and the inverse properties. We're going to start with all four properties by looking at the posters that you've seen on the wall. I'm hoping that if I kind of talk you through those posters, it'll help you understand a little bit better what you've seen on those posters. Starting with the commutative property. When you hear the commutative property, I want you to think of the word commute, which is a word that you'll use when you talk about somebody's commute to work or somebody's commute to school. That means them moving around to work or to school. So when we talk about the commutative property, we're talking about moving things around. The commutative property says that if we change the order of something, if we move them around, it doesn't change the answer. So if I have club plus heart, and I change the order, it's going to be the same thing as heart plus club. So how you order the items does not affect the answer. And you'll see that this works for addition and for multiplication. So if I show you an addition example, I see 3 plus 5 is the same thing as 5 plus 3. 3 plus 5 equals 8. If I change the order, 5 plus 3 also equals 8. So you should see this does work for addition. Both expressions equal 8. You can also see this with multiplication. If I have 3 times 5, that equals 15. And if I change the order, 5 times 3, that also equals 15. And so both expressions equal 15. And so this also works for multiplication. I want you to see that this does not work for subtraction. If I have 5 minus 3, well, that equals 2. But if I switch the order and do 3 minus 5, that equals negative 2. So the commutative property does not work for subtraction. If I try this with division, so for example 6 divided by 2, that equals 3. If I change the order of the expression and try 2 divided by 6, well, that's less than 1 whole. That's going to simplify to 1/3. So the commutative property also does not work for division. It only works for addition and for subtraction. The second property we're going to look at is the associative property. And again, I want you to look at the root word here, which is to associate. So when you think of the associative property, usually the way you'll hear the word associate is maybe friends you associate with or people you associate with. It really has to do with how you group yourself with other people. So the associative property has to do with how you group numbers. And so if you have an expression that's exactly the same, you see club, diamond, heart, and the only thing that changes is how you group them, it will not affect the answer. So the associative property states that how you group the items does not affect the answer. And again, you'll see that this works for addition and for multiplication. So if I look at an example for addition, you see 3 plus 5 plus 7 equals 3 plus 5 plus 7. The numbers are in the exact same order, so I haven't changed them using the commutative property. The only thing that's different is how they've been grouped. And the answer should still be the same. So if I add them, 3 plus 5, I'll do this first, that equals 8. And 8 plus 7, that equals 15. On the right side, if I add 5 plus 7 first, that equals 12. And then 3 plus 12, that would also equal 15. So you can see both expressions here equal 15. You can see there's actually a mistake here and on my poster. It should say both expressions equal to 15. So you just see that mistake. So it does work for addition. This also works for multiplication. So I'll show you an example of that. If I have, again, 3 times 5 times 7 equals 3 times 5 times 7, the only thing that it changes is how I group them. The answer should be the same. If I do 3 times 5, that's 15, then times 7. 15 times 7 equals 105. On the right side, if I have 5 times 7, that equals 35. And then 3 times 35 also equals 105. So you can see how I grouped them didn't affect the answer. Both expressions equaled 105. Again, there was a mistake on my poster. Should have said 105. So you can see that this works for addition and multiplication. without showing you an example, I want you to kind of just make sure that you're thinking about the fact that, again, this property works for addition and multiplication. It does not work for subtraction, and it does not work for division. Third property we're going to look at, identity property. And again, I'm going to start our conversation with looking at the actual word, the identity. And when you think of your identity, you're thinking about something that's really important about you, something that you don't want to change. And so when I think of the identity property, I think of what do you need to do to something so that you don't change its identity. So if you have, for example, club, and you add 0, you know that you're still going to end up with club. It doesn't change the identity of that object or of that number. So the identity property says if you, first with addition, add the additive identity, the sum is the same. So if you take a number like 5 and add 0, it still equals 5. So 0 is the additive identity. This is also going to work for multiplication, because if I take something like club and multiply it times 1, again we end up with club. It doesn't change its identity. You can see that with the number, that if we have 5 and we multiply times 1, we still end up with 5. So 1 is the multiplicative identity. If you multiply by the multiplicative identity, the product is the same. So here, the thing that I want you to kind of just retain in your head is that you're trying to do something to a number that won't change its identity. In the case of addition, that thing is 0, because if you add 0, it doesn't change the identity. In the case of multiplication, that thing is 1, because if you multiply by 1, it doesn't change the identity. The last property we're going to look at in this slide is one that tends to be pretty tricky, which is the inverse property. And in order to help you understand the inverse property, I want you to remind yourself what was the additive identity and what was the multiplicative identity. The additive identity was 0, because if you add 0, it doesn't change it. The multiplicative identity was 1, because if you multiply by 1, it doesn't change it. The inverse property is you need to do whatever you can to get to 0 or to get to 1. So if you look at the additive inverse, you're trying to get to 0. So if you have a number like 9 and you add negative 9, you get to 0, which was the additive identity. So it's kind of like the opposite of the identity property, because you're trying to get to that number instead of adding that number. If you look at the multiplicative identity, or excuse me, multiplicative inverse, if you take a number like 9 and multiply times 1/9, it gets you 1, which is the additive identity. So you're doing, in the case of addition, you're adding the opposite to get the identity. In the case of multiplication, you're adding the reciprocal, or excuse me, multiplying by the reciprocal to get the identity. In order to practice these properties, rather than giving you my own practice problems, I looked at the Study Island assignment for this, and I think it actually works really well for this lesson. So to practice, go to Study Island and click on the lesson titled Properties of Arithmetic. Once you've earned a blue ribbon, you're ready to retake Objective Assessment 1B, points 7 through 8. If you have already mastered that assessment, you will then be able to go on to your next video. Good luck.